get started on our roses. There are a few basics of roses to cover first. Number one, your petals will always start smaller in the center and expand bigger as you work your way outwards. And number two, your center petals should always be darker and then get lighter on the outer petals. Now for this lesson, I'm going to be using this nice burnt orangey red color from my Art Philosophy Watercolor Confections palette. But again, feel free to use any color of your choice. So I'm using a size 5 round brush here, and I'm loading up a pretty concentrated pigment of that color that I just showed. And I'm not using a ton of water on my brush here, I'm mostly just using pigment here. And I'm using just the very tip of my brush to make tiny little C strokes. So just the very tip of my brush, and just gently laying that down in the shape of a C. And these will make up the very center of the rose. I usually start with about 5 to 7 of these C strokes, just like that. And then I'm going to start adding more water onto my brush. So I'm rinsing off some of that pigment and just letting my bristles soak up some more of that water. And then I'm going to be making that same stroke, but just applying more pressure down on my brush to create thicker petals. So you're always working from thinner petals in the center of the rose and growing thicker as you work your way out. So just laying down my brush in the shape of a C with a pretty watered down mixture here. One thing to keep in mind is to leave a little bit of white space. Otherwise, your rose will just turn into a blob of color. And now I'm going to move to a size 6 brush, so just slightly larger, just so I can get those nice big fluffy petals for the very outer part. So you can actually barely see these outer petals, which is just how I want it. I want it to be really light. And just working my way around the outside, applying pressure in the shape of a C. Till you're happy with how it looks. Now I'm going to take my size 5 brush again, and I'm loading up a little bit more of a darker value. And these petals are still wet, so I'm going to just gently tap some on the inside of those petals, and you'll see the color bleed out. And that gives it a really nice soft floating effect. So just gently tapping it in, and you can see that pigment really expand out into the petals. This is just giving a nice second layer to help define those petals a little bit more. So that first layer was just about getting those initial petals down. And then second layer, it's just adding a bit of definition. I have too much liquid on my brush there, so I'm just going to dry it off and let the bristles soak up some of that excess. And I'm not adding too much extra detail on the outer petals because I want to keep those nice and light. But again, make sure to maintain some of that white space, otherwise we'll just turn into a blob of color, which we definitely don't want to happen. Just finishing up some final details here, and then we can go through this process again, because I know it takes a little bit of practice to get the hang of it. Just adding in a couple little details here. All right, I'm pretty happy with how that looks, so let's go ahead and practice one more time. Starting with my size 5 round brush. I'm getting a very pigmented color on there. Barely any water because the center of the rose is really defined. There's not bleeding and blooming going on. You want to maintain the integrity of those strokes, those little C strokes. So let's do another one right here. Using just the very tip of my brush for the dark pigment, and just gently adding in some little strokes in the shape of a C. Again, I typically make between 5 to 7 of these strokes for the center of the rose. And these are the only ones that I really care about being very defined. So I always think the center of the rose is the most important, whereas the outer petals can be loose and messy, and it looks beautiful. So now I've rinsed out some of that pigment. I have more water loaded up in my brush, and I'm applying those same C strokes, but just putting more pressure down on the brush. So it's still the shape of the C, but I'm just allowing my brush to press down on the paper like that to create a more loose bloomed petal. And you're just kind of working your way around in the circle, making sure to maintain that white space in between. So the white space is really important, especially when you're first learning how to do roses. Because that, I feel, is the most frustrating thing. Is when I was first learning roses, I didn't leave enough white space, and then my whole thing just turned into a blob of color, and I would get very frustrated. So I would err on the side of leaving too much white space than not enough, because you can always go back in and add more details, but you can't always take away color. And again, those outer petals can be really light, barely there. And then once that first layer is done, I'm getting more of that dark pigment, and these petals are still barely wet, so I'm just going to use the tip of my brush, tap in some of that pigment, and then you can see it bloom out into the rest of the petal. That's my favorite part of doing these roses. So relaxing and fun to watch. You just have to kind of be okay with letting go of control, especially when you're painting in loose style. Because watercolor is going to do what watercolor is going to do, and if you try to control it too much, then you lose that nice loose effect. So water control is still important, but as long as you have a handle on that, just have to let it do its thing for the rest of it. So again, I'm not adding too much pigment here or too much detail around the outer petals, because I want those to stay nice and light and loose. I'm just adding a little bit more definition. And this just really takes practice. I've been painting roses for several years now. Don't get too discouraged if yours don't turn out great. I'm going to add just a few more details in there. Then we'll be done. I like using colors like this too, because it allows you to have a really deep pigmented center, but then have a stark contrast between these really light peachy petals. So if you're starting out with a really light color on its own, it can be a little tricky to have that contrast. If you have one that can get nice and dark and deep like this, and then you can water it down to get a nice light effect on the outside, it really achieves a nice contrasted look. So just experiment with different colors as you go. I'm just kind of filling in some gaps here where I see not enough definitions. Keeping the color nice and light here on the outside. And just brushing out some of those outer petals. All right, so there you have it. That's a basic loose style rose. Feel free to just let your brush kind of dance on the page. Don't try to control your strokes too much. So feel free to keep practicing your roses. Try not to get too frustrated. I know this can definitely be one of the more frustrating flowers to learn when you're first starting out, but remember to keep that white space. Remember to go from dark to light, and just keep practicing.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all of our latest videos.